Welcome to the first webinar by the Association for Psychedelic Education and Culture. My name is Henry Soinunmaa. I'm the chairman of the association. And for our first webinar, we have as a presenter Jerónimo M.M. From Spain, who is an ayahuasca community activist and independent researcher. Jerónimo works as a social innovation coordinator for the ICEERS Foundation, which is the International Center for Ethnobotanical Education, Research and Service. And Jerónimo is also a founding member of the Plataforma, which is the platform for the defense of ayahuasca. I'm very glad to have Jerónimo as our first presenter, because since I first heard him a couple of years ago in the Break-In Convention conference in London, I really felt that his ability to perceive important questions related to psychedelics is just phenomenal. So I felt instantly that I want to do more with this guy. So I'm very glad to have you here, Jerónimo.
Thank you both for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here for the first webinar myself.
As a co-host, we also have Tommi Vehmas. He's a Bachelor of Theology and an instrument teacher who's written and keeps writing quality posts in our blog. So also welcome, Tommi.
Okay. So yeah, hi everybody. I see there's about 50 people here. Welcome. Thank you again to Henry and to the Psychedelic Association for inviting me. Today I'm going to talk about, something that I've been thinking about and researching for quite some time, which is, what is going to happen after the psychedelic renaissance. The psychedelic renaissance is where we are right now. It's been sort of like an explosion of interest, research, and investment around psychedelics. And I'm wondering, what could or is to come, if we sort of try to think 15 or 20 or 25 years into the future. That's what I mean by a post-prohibition world. So, a little bit about us, like Henry said, I work for ICEERS. ICEERS, for those that don't know, it's a Barcelona-based NGO who turned 10 years old last year, a couple of years ago, actually. We're a small NGO, maybe, less than 30 people, including volunteers. But we've done a lot of work over the years, including, organizing the 3 World Ayahuasca conferences and a number of other things that I will speak about. But, I would say one characteristic of ICEERS within the sort of larger psychedelic scene is that we are focused on, plants and fungi that have a history of traditional use. So we deal mostly with plants, psychedelics, and and psychoactive plants, not compounds. And we are very interested in how these plants or practices that are reaching outside of their countries of origin. And that's where most of our work is based. But we have a very important commitment to also the peoples and cultures from where these plants originate. So it's a sort of triple focus. One has to do with plants. It has to do with plants outside of the countries of origin, but at the same time, it's very much looking towards the communities of origin and what that means and what are sort of the relationships and the bridges that can be established between both things. So yeah, my name is Jerónimo, and I'm a social innovation coordinator at ICEERS. So social means groups of people, and innovation means new things, and the social innovation means trying to get groups of people to do new things. Basically, most of my work revolves around the ritual use of ayahuasca and the people who work around the ritual use of ayahuasca, especially, again, or mostly outside of the countries of origin. I've been myself personally involved in the world of ayahuasca for more than 20 years. I made a number of documentaries, I've researched. I mean, there's been a number of that I will go into it, but I would just say that it's been for me a very long path now around these topics, and the reason why it's been very long is because I've had very important personal experiences around this, and this has become it went from being a personal thing to being a personal commitment, and from being a personal commitment to being a sort of wider service to the community. I've been always around people who work with ayahuasca. I don't work with ayahuasca myself. I work with people who work with ayahuasca. That'll be the summary of it. But in terms of ICR's work, our objective is to sort of help transform the relationship of societies outside of the countries of origin with these plants, with these sort of plants and practices that are now arriving. And this job has like two obvious parts. One part, it's sort of reactive. That is, there are certain pressing needs, and then we can try to, there's a gap, there's a need, and we can try to fulfill it. For example, there's certain gaps on what science knows about ayahuasca, for example. So, we're learning more and more about how it can be useful to treat certain conditions, like depression or addiction, but we don't know so much about how it affects the people who are not exactly ill, So how does it affect, quote unquote, healthy people or normal people, which in fact are sort of the majority of the people who are consuming ayahuasca. So there was a space, a gap. And what we did is we put together, ICR's put together a research project that was led by our clinical director, Jose Carlos Bozo. And what he did is he took a number of what is called global mental health markers, which are it's a number of sort of questions that are shared between many scientists in many different studies. So as long as you use the same markers, then you can do your own study and still compare with other populations. And what this helped us do when he used these markers is that we were able to compare ayahuasca users to the general population, even though we hadn't done a study about the general population, but we had other studies that had been done with the same markers. I hope this makes sense. Some of the things that came to light, for example, was this. This is actually, so I'm not only, mostly healthy people seem to be using ayahuasca, but of those healthy people that were using ayahuasca, most of them end up reducing their use of prescription drugs due to ayahuasca use. This is of course interesting because this sort of turns on its head the sort of public health argument that most people make for sort of drug control or drug, drugs are forbidden because they're supposed to be bad for people's health and they're supposed to be dangerous. But what we're seeing here in these numbers is that actually they seem to improve people's health, or at least they seem to lower their need for prescription drugs. And this has, of course, implications for policy and and many other things, and sort of also public health and how much the public system spends. This study, when what we did is beyond doing this study, which now we're going to do in other countries. We did it in Spain, but we intend to do it in other countries. We also created a media campaign about it in Spain with press conferences, with roundtables in 3 different cities, where the results were discussed among scientists and experts and legal experts and stuff. So this is an example of the type of stuff that we do. This is another one you might have heard about. Is the Ayahuasca Defense Fund. The Ayahuasca Defense Fund, it's sort of it's a project that gives legal support to people who get in trouble for working with plants, who just basically get arrested or have to go to trial. So, we help we advise their lawyers, we help with legal experts, we help, we believe people shouldn't go to jail for this. So when people are in danger of doing, we try to help make sure that this doesn't happen. Now, in the last 5 years, we've given support to more than 150 cases in 29 countries. And we've come to some quite important rulings, especially in Spain. I'm not going to go into it, but these are 2 examples of things that we do. There's a need, there's a need, there's gap in science, and we can react to that. People are getting arrested, and we can react to that and try to help. These are reactive measures. There's a problem, and we react to it. But today, I want to talk about something else that is, personally been keeping me up at night for many years, and it's been part of my work for the last 5 years. And it has to do, it's not so much a sort of reactive, but proactive. So it has to do with a problem that doesn't exist yet, but that might exist in the future. And it has to do with the suspicion, that I have, that, if the legal and scientific barriers that we have, we saw some examples of the scientific barriers that we don't know, and some examples of the legal barriers, what is forbidden, But if these things fell down, tomorrow, if the government came tomorrow and asked us, hey, we're interested in integrating, these plants, let's say ayahuasca, into our societies, how should we do it? The reality is we actually, most of us, myself included, wouldn't have a very clear idea of how that could be done. We all have a very clear idea that prohibition is wrong, and a very sort of clear intuition that there's certain promise to this, that it looks like that these substances or these plants could really help. But we actually, there isn't much, and I can now say it sort of, scientifically, because I've been interviewing a number of people and we've been asking the same question, and everybody has, many people have a very good idea of how things could go wrong, but very few people have a very clear idea of how things could go right in the integration of psychedelics into our societies. So my own, this painting is the psychedelic Renaissance, is from the Renaissance, and it's as psychedelic as it gets. It's really old. So generally speaking, this process now, this psychedelic Renaissance, as it's called, where it's getting all of this investment and newfound interest in psychedelics. Something it looks like things are going to change quite fast. I think it's a great thing, but I think it also gives a certain blindness, because it seems that once we have, enough science, and once we have a positive legal framework, then we'll be done, and and we will be, psychedelics will be integrated, but I don't think so. I think actually when that happens will be the beginning of the real challenges. The real challenges that psychedelics presents our culture, and what are those challenges? There's a Japanese saying, that says that, when all you have is a hammer, everything begins to look like a nail. Now, with this, what they mean is that the tools that we have at our disposal, on one hand, help us, and on the other hand, they limit our perception of what can be done. So because you have a hammer, you're thinking of hammering down and everything looks like a nail. So what happens when reality is wider than our tools, because reality is wider than hammers and nails? It's often this, is what you see here, is that we try to sort of fit, round, square pegs into round holes, and we just do it by hammering down. As we end up amputating parts of the piece that simply don't fit, right? So I'll give you an example so it's more clear. This is, some people doing yoga. As everybody knows, yoga comes from India, and it was originally focused in the spiritual development of people through body movement and awareness. Now, in our cultures, we don't really have a space for something like this, for something that combines, you could say, movement and prayer. So we fit it on the space that we already had, the gym, which is the space for movement in our society, right? So in many cases, not in all, but in many cases, what we do is we sort of cut off or amputate the spiritual stuff, the Sanskrit, the esoteric teachings of yoga, and we potentiate sort of the physical and health aspect, which is the part that we can understand or that we have. So in some, not in all, but in many places in the West, yoga is not practiced as a path to enlightenment, but as a path to an attractive body. So this is an example of, we have the gym and that's our hammer, and then yoga begins to look like a nail. And we begin to fit it into this sort of framework because that's what we have, right? So obviously, I don't come to talk about yoga, but just I come to talk about the way our societies find spaces to fit new practices that are foreign. Because I believe that the ritual use of certain plants, for example, ayahuasca, present our societies with precisely this type of challenge. Now, here we have a new foreign practice, and where are we going to put it? And what is going to get cut off or cut out of the parts for which we have no space? So that's the ritual use of ayahuasca. So, we don't have space for these practices. So we tend to sort of hammer them into the slots we have. That's the danger. So, for example, ayahuasca has recently been included in the new psychoactive substances category. Now, this is a category that was made by, law enforcement, having to do with a lot of like research chemicals and these sort of new things that were coming up, new drugs that would appear, new psychoactive substances. But in reality, ayahuasca, it's not new. It's actually ancient, and they're not substances, but they're plants. and their context of use is completely different from the new research chemicals that people tend to consume recreationally. However, that's the box we had, new psychoactive substances, and that's the box where it went, right? So part of our work in ICERS is trying to avoid that these practices are sort of hammered into the boxes that we have, instead of fitted in the boxes where they belong. So I'm going to focus on a single case here, which is that of ayahuasca. I'm just going to try to bring to light the original object and the original context. So, so we begin to understand what we're looking at, not what we have. So from this, we can think about possible solutions, within the societies that we live, which are our societies. They're not Amazonian societies, which is from where this practice originate. So, some just thought experiment or something that I've, for some reason, often thought about. I've spent a lot of time in the Amazon, often or almost always around ayahuasca. And, very often these nights, I've come to think of where this all started. As you know, ayahuasca it's a formula, and, as it's widely known, is the preparation, is the decoction of two plants. So for ayahuasca to work in this way, you need the two plants, and this is a product. This is something is prepared. This is not like peyote and other plants, which are you just take the plant as it is, or the mushrooms. Ayahuasca is actually a preparation. It's man-made. Somebody came up with this at some point. There's some discussion. It could be hundreds of years ago. It could be thousands of years ago. Nobody really knows, but we know somebody somewhere in the Amazon figured out that these two plants could be put together and cooked together. And this person, which I often think about or try to imagine, sort of kickstarted a process, that continues all the way to here, all the way to us talking about it right now, right? It just sort of set off a chain of events, So I'm going to just travel a little bit back and forth along this timeline to try to understand how we got there from that person all the way to us having this conversation here. And how this sort of like exotic cultural phenomenon that happened thousands of years ago has made it all the way here. So we can better think about what might come next, because the actual expansion, the process that led from here from there to here actually continues to this day and is still expanding, right? So, again, when we go back to sort of ayahuasca year zero, one indigenous person in the Amazon discovers this formula and begins to work with their community. And then from this community, we can only assume it jumps to other communities, and then to other communities, and then to other communities, and it begins to expand, from his clan to his group, to the neighboring groups, and then to even further in a process that probably takes hundreds of years, all the way to today, where there's like dozens of different indigenous groups that traditionally have been using ayahuasca over many countries in the Amazon basin, and where it's in the cultures that traditionally use it, you find sort of very deeply integrated into the culture. It's a very important part of the culture, of the way they think and the way they live and the way they understand reality. I'm just going to give two very quick examples. Just one is the Putumayo communities in the Colombian Amazon, and they use yahe, which is a slightly different formula, but still two plants. This is and what you find here is that ayahuasca takes a very important role, not just in healing, which we're more used to, but in community sort of. In social aspects, in community leadership, in community decision making, and sort of in community policy. Ayahuasca is an important community activity that lets people decide and question and come together to solutions, and even children participate very often in these things. That's how deeply integrated it is in the community. And then in Peru, you have the Shipibo people. And in the Shipibo people, the medical aspect of ayahuasca is very potentiated, it's very important, and there's a very well-developed, complex sort of medical system, technology around ayahuasca. These are the onayas, which includes, the sort of plant dietas, which are more particular to the Amazon than they're to Colombia. These are just two examples of many, and I'm going very fast for it because I want to get to the next step. The next step, what happens is that ayahuasca keeps expanding, from one indigenous group to another, and then as the jungle gets colonized, and towns and cities grow, a new type of Amazonian culture emerges, which is mestizo. It's a mixed blood of it. It has part indigenous, part settler, part colonist. And out of these come two new aspects of ayahuasca culture. One is what is known as vegetalismo, which is sort of it contains many elements. Part indigenous, part Spanish folk medicine, part Christian and Catholic, part foreign, and all of this gets cooked into this sort of like a folk healing tradition around the use of ayahuasca that is very widespread all over the Amazon. And these are now we're getting to like sort of urban areas. And then the other one are the ayahuasca religions. The ayahuasca religions, which started in Brazil about 100 years ago with the Santo Daime, and initially, and which have sort of also expanded themselves to different lineages. And there's about three main churches. The União de Vegetal, which is the largest, the Barquinha, and the Santo Daime. But there's others. So what we find ourselves, generally speaking, is that actually, if you look at ayahuasca in the Amazon, what you find is actually a very large, thriving culture, right? So, the ayahuasca religions also have spread all over the world. But right now in the Amazon, many countries, for sure, tens of thousands of people, just the ayahuasca churches are tens of thousands of people, but probably hundreds of thousands of people in the Amazon are participating, of ayahuasca rituals in some way or another. So this is really very large, thriving culture within the Amazon with, like multifaceted, with many different expressions. And lately, it's gone global. It's gone global, that is reached beyond the Amazon, it's reached other American countries and then other European countries. And then, you can now find it as far as Asia and places like this. But, what's important sort of to see is that it's the same process, and it never stopped from the first day that this formula was identified. You could say that ayahuasca has never ceased to expand itself, crossing borders from one group to the other, from one community to the other, from one country to the other, and it keeps expanding. It's what it's done. What's interesting too is that this expansion has happened without any pressure from above, right? This has not been ever a matter of government policy or the interest on some culture or another to make this grow. It has grown by itself with sort of no outside help, just because I think it's useful. People find it useful. And that's why ayahuasca keeps expanding and going from one place to another, and it keeps jumping borders and going to other communities. How is it useful? Well, this is the thing. Different people find it useful in different ways. So you can see indigenous use where it's like, it's very important, for example, for hunting or for community relationships. And then in other places it's used for healing, and then in other places is used for praying and for spiritual practices. So one would think that there's no, and now as it reaches our cultures, it seems to be very useful for sort of psychotherapeutic processes. So you would say, when you first look at it, that there's actually, it seems that there's no common ground to the way people are using ayahuasca. They're using it differently in different cultures, and you cannot say, you cannot find what's the common thread between psychotherapy and hunting, for example. The common thread, of course, is survival. The common thread is adapting to life. The common thread is how do you best live in this world. And what seems to happen, and this is the concept that we are using, it's adaptogen. What ayahuasca does is it seems to help people adapt to their reality, adapt to their environment, adapt to their needs, adapt to what is required of them. And in different cultures, this takes different shapes. So for hunting cultures, hunting is very important. And for cultures like ourselves, where hunting is not so important and sort of like material survival, it's if not guaranteed, it's pretty certain. Suddenly we have other types of problems that require psychotherapy, for example. So what you see, or what I think we see, together with this expansion, is this shift what seems to be a constant change in what is used for, but in fact it's not. It's a constant, it just keeps finding ways of making it itself useful for the different cultures as they need it. No? So I'm going to go back now that we've seen sort of like the indigenous history or the Amazonian history of this. And I'm going to bring, white people into the picture. I think most people know that in Columbus time, the most expensive thing that there was not gold, or diamonds or jewelry, but spices. By spices, I mean, pepper, ginger, turmeric, these things that we, buy in stores now for next to nothing. In the time of Columbus, they were, extremely expensive all over Europe. They were, rich people. It was considered a great sign of class and luxury to have access to these things. So much so that aristocrats would put these spices on trays like treats that their guests ate directly. They would eat the pepper directly, not even put it in the food. And these flavors were so surprising, and they were so amazing to Europeans, these flavors, that they theorized that these plants couldn't be natural, but they were somewhat magical, that they actually grew out of the banks of the rivers that flew from paradise, because they believed paradise was still somewhere on earth, and the river still flew. And out of these banks grew ginger and pepper and these incredible flavors that were so mind-blowing for Europeans at the time. So it is these wonderful plants of indescribable flavors, that actually led Columbus to look for new routes. These plants were so valuable, and the Portuguese had control of the southern route that went around Africa, that finding a new route to India, was really literally, making, huge amounts of money, if you can understand. So what happened to Columbus was that, as everybody knows, instead of finding a new route to India, what Columbus found was the American continent. And with this was the beginning of a very rich, botanical exchange, but not the one that Columbus imagined. In fact, in the chronicles of the time, we know that for many years in the court of Spain, people made fun of Columbus. And they say, hey, Columbus, where are the spices? Because discovering new land, it seemed to have no value compared to what they expected, the value that they expected to get from getting a new route. This also, I think, explains a lot of the, very brutal sort of colonization. There was a huge disappointment that happened as people realized that they hadn't found a route to the spices, which was to a pile of money, and instead they found a new land. And then the question became, well, how can we make money out of this? But I'm digressing. That's not. So what happens? So, but what I want to say basically is that the fact that in remote countries, there are plants with fascinating virtues is not new, and it's not tangential to the story. It's actually been a real historical engine of change with hugely marked consequences, as we will see, and it continues to do so. And in a way, ayahuasca still fits, within this. So this that you see here is what is called the Colombian Exchange. So this is the botanical exchange that happened between plants that came from the Americas and things that went to the Americas. So the Americas, gave us a series of very important plants, corn, Europeans, corn, potatoes, tomatoes, and Europeans brought other plants to the Americas, like bananas that actually come from Asia, mango, or coffee that doesn't come from Colombia, it actually comes from Yemen. So to give you an idea of the scale and the effects of this exchange, because this is the part that is important to understand why I'm telling this story. Potatoes or corn alone are responsible for 25% of the population growth in Europe for the next 200 years. So one quarter of the people being born, not starving, were thanks to potato and corn alone, right? So we're talking about really true historical and economic forces. No, we're not talking about something small. This is so big that it's actually invisible because it's everywhere. So a similar example of what I mean is coca. Coca is a plant that comes from the Americas that we can say that has actually been split in two, and then divided in two, it has taken over the world. So one part is the part that is more known, which is cocaine, right? So cocaine, can now be found just about in any city of any significant size all over the world, But the other one that is less known is the decocanized leaf extract. So this, when you take the cocaine, you take the coca leaf and you take the cocaine out, and then the leaf extract, what is left, that is to this date still part of the secret formula of Coca-Cola. So every time you drink Coca-Cola, you're actually drinking some coca leaf extract. So that nowadays, the entire world consumes coca products, either as Coca-Cola or as cocaine. So again, this is so large that it's actually invisible, because Coca-Cola is sold in more than 200 countries and more than 1.9 billion servings of Coca-Cola every day. So, what I want to sort of, bring our attention to is that, well, that plants have power, but that there's some plants that have been really, truly powerful in the sense of historically shifting history by their presence. So, I will give another example. Tomatoes came from the Americas and went to Europe and actually survived as garden ornaments. Nobody could figure out what to do with them or how to eat them. So they sort of survived as sort of garden plants because people thought they were beautiful, like the fruit. It took more than 200 years for them to become food in Europe. And this, of course, happened in Italy. While potato adoption in Europe is measured, that it's also measured in hundreds of. So something similar happened with potatoes. It also took about hundreds of years for Europe to sort of take over potatoes. But for example, tobacco, which also comes from America, was already being consumed in Japan only 50 years after the discovery after the encounter with America. 50 years later, people were already smoking in Japan. So that's how useful or how quickly that, the only other American import that crossed the world so fast was syphilis, which is also rumored to have come from America. No, so this is the other exchange that happened between the Americas and the rest of the world, and is the exchange of powerful psychoactive plants. There's something that is particular that can be observed about this, but also with the other ones, is that the plants traveled, and sometimes, like we saw with tobacco, they traveled very fast. But what didn't travel was the knowledge associated with these plants or how to use them. So I will explain, in each culture, if you give each culture enough time to live with plants and substances, the cultures tend to find spaces and develop sort of a body of best practices that maximizes the benefits and reduces the risks. So I'll give an example so it's very clear. I come from Spain. So in the Mediterranean, where I am from, after thousands of years living together with wine, which is literally tens of thousands of years old, we have developed a culture around it and a number of rules. There's times of the day, wine is not drunk for breakfast, for example. There's also certain containers, there's temperatures that enhance the benefits and reduce the risks. And so we can live in a relationship that I would call quite positive with wine in Mediterranean countries. It's also negative. Wine is the favorite drink of abuse of homeless people in Spain, for example. But we can say wine abuse is a minority, and that most Spaniards, sort of have a quite positive relationship with wine. So much so, that if we were offered to change a glass of our wine for its equivalent active compound, which would be, pure ethyl alcohol, the vast majority of Spaniards or Mediterraneans would not want it. We wouldn't want the active compound of wine. Our wine is just fine as it is. Similarly, an indigenous Kogi or Macuna from South America, from whom the consumption of coca leaf is an ancestral ritual of regular practice and of extreme cultural value, would show a similar disgust if we offer to change their carefully collected and toasted coca leaf for pure cocaine. What am I going to want that for if my coca leaf is much richer, much tastier, and much less toxic? However, if we offer them the same pure ethyl alcohol that we ourselves had rejected, we might find some interest. Just like we are interested ourselves in pure cocaine. So here we begin to see a pattern, right? Cultures use and or abuse substances depending on the nature of the relationship they've been able to develop with them. So I would argue that both prohibition and also the purification of active compounds that goes with prohibition tend to make this encounter of cultures and substances much more complicated. But I digress. From America to Europe, we see this again and again. Cocoa, was a bitter drink for the Aztecs. In the court of the Aztec emperor, there was a man whose only job was to make the foam in the cocoa drink as big as possible. And this took many pouring back and forth. I mean, it was a science, it was an art to prepare this bitter cocoa drink that the Aztecs made, which also had like hot chilies, and I'm sure it was delicious. But we took that foamy, delicious, bitter and spicy drink, and we turned it into solid, sweet tablet, and we called it chocolate. So, tobacco in South America is a very strong plant, Nicotina rustica, and it was used occasionally and, very often, but not just smoked. It was insufflated, it was sniffed, it was drunk, it was chewed, and Europeans took tobacco, greatly reduced its potency, they took Virginia tobacco, which is a different blend, and we put it into fine cigarettes of constant and compulsive use. So of all the plants that come to us from America, our use never quite resembled the original. And with this, I would argue, we lost some of the accumulated wisdom, or others would say best practices, that came from the original context. Right? So, it's very simple. It doesn't seem far-fetched to say that someone ignorant but interested in wine would do well to start by studying winemaking in the Mediterranean basin. By that same rule of three, somebody ignorant of coca would do well to start by asking those who have hundreds of or thousands of years of relationship with this leaf, such as the kogi or the macuna. Well, in the last 500 years of exchange between the Americas and the rest of the world, we see that this has never happened, right? The plant is taken and the original context is discarded. One could almost speak of a pattern, right? Until we reach ayahuasca and something happens that, in my opinion, is unique to these times. And this is what happens. So this is an ayahuasca ritual in Peru. Also, I would like to say, sort of as a parenthesis, that I'm going to use a very reduced, very reductionistic lens. The cultural body of work around these plants is really rich. It's mythology, it's poetry, it's culture. It's also political, for the original cultures. But for this talk, I'm just going to focus on something that is, quite small, which we could call best practices. So what do we see? A group meets to take ayahuasca, and they're led by a kind of facilitator or a guide who has more experience, directs the session, and takes responsibility over the experience of others. Now, if we came to Europe, what would we see? Well, we would see something very similar. A group meets to take ayahuasca, led by a guide who has more experience than others, administers the dose, directs the session, and takes charge of the experience of others. Sometimes even the songs and the rituals are the same as in South America. So in other words, an American power plant or plant teacher has been imported into outside of the countries of origin for the first time in history, with a significant part of the original context still in place. This has never happened before. It didn't happen with tobacco. It didn't happen with coca. It didn't happen with cocoa. It didn't happen with mushrooms. It just had not happened. So now the question becomes, what are we going to do with it? Now we have a plant that has arrived to us with important part of its context. And now what are we going to do with it? How are we going to integrate it into our societies? And then the problem that we have is this, is where to fit it. Now, what you can see here is a sort of a three-dimensional, like multi-dimensional figure, right? So the figure that you see that is gray in the middle, that's the actual figure, right? It's 3D. And then what you see on the sides are sort of projections. So this means that if you take that figure and you look at it directly from above, it looks like an L. And if you look at it directly from one side, it looks like a square. And if you look at it from this other side, it looks like sort of trapezoid figure. The actual figure is neither one of these things, and it's these three things at the same time, right? I think the challenge that sort of ayahuasca and these plants present to us is exactly this. is that it's a multidimensional figure. Ayahuasca presents us sort of a multidimensional figure, and depending on which plane you look at it from, it looks like something else. So it's sort of, you take ayahuasca and you look at it like this, it looks like sort of a spiritual practice, and you can see this in the churches. But it's a spiritual, but it doesn't really conform to what we would define as religion. And we don't really have a place for spirituality that includes high doses of mind-altering substances. And also because calling shamanism a religion is also problematic in many aspects. And then if you turn this object this way, then it looks like therapy. And there's many therapeutic aspects to it. But the thing is, we don't have a space for this idea of guided pharmacology, for medicines whose effects require being accompanied by the doctor while they happen, much less medicines that sometimes ask the doctor to take them together with the patient. And then there's another aspect after you turn it in this other direction, and it looks like something that in our culture would, in the original culture would be called teachings. And then our culture would be called, I don't know, something having to do with education or personal growth or self-knowledge. And this we simply don't have. Where do we fit, any sort of education that is guided by plants? So we're faced with this, we're looking at this thing depending on what the angle we look at, it looks like a spirituality, or it looks like therapy, or it looks like some sort of like personal growth or education. And all of these things are true, but the actual truth is the complete object, So any fit that we give it, so whether we say that, we're going to integrate this plant as a spirituality, or whether we say we're going to integrate these practices as therapy or medical, or whether we say we're going to integrate these practices as personal growth, we're always leaving the other pieces out. And we're going to tend to amputate the things, right? So, and even this sort of metaphor that I use here of this sort of 3D object is itself a hammer that is nailing down differences, because I just said like 3 aspects of it, but there's more. There's recreational use, there's use for creativity. This is really, actually, it's not even 3-dimensional, it's multidimensional. So how can we avoid this? Right? I mean, it's great to make, an ornamental plant out of tomatoes, but the world would be a much sadder place without tomato sauce, without pasta, without pizza, right? So how do we avoid, now we are presented, and this is what I mean by the cultural challenges, we're presented with something for which we don't have, we even lack sort of categories, even if we wanted to make ayahuasca legal, we don't even have the proper boxes, the proper categories that would actually fit all of these different aspects of it. So this is sort of a very drawn example of, the law of unintended consequences. The law of unintended consequences is just a name given to the very maddening fact that every new solution to an existing problem tends to bring new and sometimes worse problems. So here's this man, and he pushed this block, and it looked like that's all he did, but he's coming back and he's going to fall on his head. Now, most policy changes are driven, by the law of unintended consequences. Governments make a decision that seems like a sensitive and good idea, but they didn't think of all the things that can happen. And then some of these things turn out to be much worse than the problem that they were trying to fix. So a classic example of this, of course, is alcohol prohibition in the 1920s in the United States. Alcohol was then, and it still is, a link to all sorts of trouble, accidents, violence, to the destruction of human beings. So the hypothesis in the 1920s was that if we ban alcohol, then alcohol-related problems will go down. In fact, what happened was the problems got much worse. So things went from a system of small-time alcohol suppliers to a business that was consolidated under hold of large-scale organized crime over the illegal alcohol industry. So that's the beginning of the mafia, Al Capone. I mean, the story. Since alcohol was still popular, even though it was illegal, criminal organizations producing alcohol were very well funded. And this also increased their other activities, all of them problematic, increased corruption, increased violence. The alcohol prohibition was recalled some years later, but we're still dealing with the unintended consequences of other prohibitions. I think it's fair to say that most of us in this webinar are anti-prohibitionists. We believe that drugs, the war on drugs should end. But what would be the unintended consequences of ending prohibition? What would be the unintended consequences of ending the prohibition of psychedelics? So we're thinking about what the good outcomes would be, the same way that people that put prohibition in place, that we're thinking of good outcomes. But are we thinking of what are the negative outcomes that can come out of this? We have some examples of how things just get complicated very fast. As you know, Canada has taken large steps to sort of legalize and regulate the recreational use of cannabis. So cannabis was decriminalized, and a legal path was paved for cannabis production and distribution. Now, like everything, this had costs. Costs are usually the cost of making anything legal are usually legal costs. It's basically bureaucracy that increases greatly. So but it wasn't that. What happened basically was two things. One was that by making a legal path to producing cannabis, they actually, without intending it, ended up kicking out of this system all of the people that were traditional cannabis growers. That's because traditional cannabis growers, they were very good at growing cannabis, and they were very good at knowing their cannabis, but they were not very good at starting a company, dealing with permits, getting lawyers, all of these things. However, a bunch of other companies that were not so good with cannabis and knew nothing about cannabis, but they were good at setting up companies and dealing with bureaucracy, they tend to take over the market, and they push these traditional growers out. Now, when these traditional growers were deprived of their traditional means, their traditional economy, many of them moved to harder and more dangerous substances. That's an example of unintended consequences of regulatory practices, or good intention or even good ideas. This is another big problem that they had, was that because they didn't want, to protect, minors and children and all of these things, cannabis is sold in these white boxes, that you see there, and they cannot be open. So people have to, the legal dispensaries of cannabis in Canada, you find this row of white sort of boxes. You cannot open it, you cannot smell the cannabis, you cannot taste it, and very often it's very dry because it's overstuffed. So, and it's more expensive than in the black market. So in a way, this well-intentioned thing has actually managed to just push traditional growers out of the system, give it to new companies, and actually put on the market product that, as far as the audience is concerned, is inferior quality and higher in price than what was available in the black market. And this is another example of how the law of unintended consequences work, right? So the danger that we face is that we think that the challenge facing psychedelics is a legal challenge or is a scientific challenge, and that our problems are going to be solved by a combination of decriminalization, medicalization, and harm reduction. But my intuition is that the resistance we see in mainstream science and also in the law of states to psychedelics are not the problem, they're actually the symptom of the real problem, which is that as societies, we are complete novices in the art of handling psychedelics, of interpreting psychedelics, of administering psychedelics, and of policing psychedelics and regulating psychedelics. We are very, very new at this. And we know how many mistakes people who are new at anything makes, from dancing to tennis to driving cars. People who are new at things are usually bad at things. So how do we deal with an object that is multidimensional, that fits none of the categories that we presently have, right? So, for example, I'm a supporter of the medicalization of psychedelics. I think it's a good thing that doctors will be able to prescribe these substances to people who need them and who currently have very bad options. However, in our societies, we have significant penalties for people who practice medicine or administer prescription medicines without a license. So while I think it's commendable, for example, that psilocybin will one day be available to people with depression, I think it would be sad if that means that in the future, only licensed psychedelic therapists or psychiatrists can work with it. What would happen to Mazatec people who have been working with mushrooms for thousands of years, and would they get arrested if they bring their practices over to our culture, right? So another example, I think it's fundamentally important, an issue of human rights and human dignity, that people following the Brazilian ayahuasca religions get permission to practice their spirituality in the global north. However, it is sad if that means that shamanic practitioners are forced to fit into our very narrow sense of what religion is in order to be able to do their work. So this is what you see. Like, the danger is that when you open one door, the medical door, the spiritual door, whatever, you sort of close others. And this is built into the way we do it, and so on and so forth. Every time we fit psychedelics into a new box, we find ourselves forcing them into this peg and amputating some of the richness that is around it. So the challenge that psychedelics present our culture is much larger than the current barriers. It's not just legal or scientific. It's actually a cultural challenge. In a way, we as a culture lack the proper frames, the tools, the categories even, to fully integrate psychedelics into our societies. So that the danger is that in the path of transforming the relationship of our societies with psychedelics, we will end up transforming psychedelics until our society, as it is today, can digest them. And in the process, we'll be losing much of their richness. Okay, so now that everybody is depressed, let's look at some optimistic solutions on what to do. And I'm getting to the end of the talk. Thank you for being with me all the way here. Now, for many years, I worked as a user experience designer. I'm not going to go into what that means. I'm just going to say that we were faced with a lot of situations like this. So this is called the desire path metaphor. You make a design, a plan, a solution, and that's sort of the sidewalk that you see in the shape of an L. And then when you implement it, when you build it, people go and do something completely different. They cut across the lawn, right? And when people were making the architect or the urbanist that make this plan for this, particular sort of, garden area, he, on his plans, this looked really, really good. And this was the path that people were going to follow. And the path that people were going to follow was paved. And then this was the green area, and the green area was not for walking. But then when you build it, people go and they do something completely different. Now, you could say that this is, the law, and that's drug traffic and drug traffickers as well, right? Or, or the mafia, right? That's what the mafia did as well. The law said, no alcohol, no walking, no walk this way. And then the mafia did that. Or you could also say this, this is policy and these are people, right? Policy of any type, really. So when sort of a government body, or an administrative body or any sort, or sort of a planner is faced with this activity, you can do a number of things. You could, for example, put a sign that says, don't step on the grass. Or you could put up a fence, so that people cannot walk through that place. Or you could even have a cop come by every once in a while and give people a fine who are walking on this place, right? Whatever you do, people with a good reason are going to resent it. And that's because this path is actually more efficient. It's shorter. In a way, this path is actually superior to the design. It's superior to the policy. It's superior to the plan. So what can, knowing this, what can sort of like enlightened administrations or government bodies do? Well, this is an example I like very much. This is from a university in the United States. And what they did is they made the buildings and they didn't pave the paths. They just let the students walk any way they wanted. And then after a year or two, when these sort of paths in the middle, where people go, were already made on the grass, then the administration came and they paved them, right? So what you can see is the result is like actually quite complex and elaborate sort of like network of paths. Is very, very different from what a human being or an architect would design, right? So, and some paths are quite obvious, right? Between buildings, you can see on this sort of circle in the middle and these sort of straight lines between buildings. There's some paths that are quite obvious, and there's some paths, and those could be like, this could be, you know, medicalization or freedom of religion. This sort of like obvious paths for these substances. But then, you know, what architect would have thought about all of these sort of like strange paths that go in, you know, very sort of, you know, non-intuitive directions? You know, these are actually the shortest path between 2 points. And these paths are an emergent property of the system. This is something that is only seen when you let people use the system. You know, you cannot, it's very, very hard to think ahead of it. So when an administration observes the paths that people take, and then they pave those paths, you know, what they do is, one, they're reducing the harm. You know, paved paths, you know, you don't get muddy, you don't get dirty, you don't slip, you know, when everything is wet, you know. But actually also what you're doing is you're entering into a dialogue with the population that is actually based on facilitating organic processes, supporting what people do and minimizing the impacts for them, helping them out. I see that you're often taking this path. Now, when it rains, it gets muddy. I'm going to pave over so you don't get dirty. So it is in this dialogue, you know, between enlightened administration and the wisdom that emerges from the terrain, from the activities that people are already taking, you know, where the solutions that, in my opinion, are the most optimal are found. It's because they're the easiest, and at the same time, they're the most efficient. Now, what I mean by this metaphor is that to the problem of how are psychedelics going to be integrated into our societies, or, you know, even, you know, the problem that I'm most often thinking about, just ayahuasca. It is unfortunately up to us, the psychedelic community, to come up and propose these solutions, because nobody is going to do a better job than us, and it's a difficult question. You know, it's not. But what we cannot expect is that some government out there by themselves will come up with the most optimal solution for the problem at hand, because they just simply lack all of this knowledge that comes from being there and being in place. No? So this is sort of where my work begins. You know, and this has to do a lot with the work I'm doing. I've spoken a lot already. This is my last slide, and we can go into this in the Q&A. I'm just going to speak very quickly about how all of these things come together and the type of work that I'm doing, that we're doing at ICERS, you know. And in terms of, you know, when we think about the future integration of these practices, you know, and we try to look 15 and 20, 25 years into the future, what is it that needs to happen, you know? Now, first of all, we need to define what the pathways are. And these are meant by the regulatory models. Like, how would this be, you know, what type of regulatory pathways are we going to look at? Is this going to be a medical thing? Is this going to be a spiritual thing? Is this going to be a religious thing? Is this going to be a therapeutic thing? Do we need to think of a wider category? This is like, this is part of sort of an ongoing research and program that we're doing, looking at different examples and trying to come up with a few proposals for how could it be, and also of alliances, what other sort of collectives could help us with this. And then the pathways have to do with what the governments would need to change. And then there's another aspect that has to do with community organizing, and this has to do with not what the government would need to change, but what the ayahuasca facilitators and guides themselves would need to change. How much does the game of your average ayahuasca provider need to change in order to come to a place where he would be taken seriously by our societies as it is, and the practice would be respected? You know, so this has to do with processes of self-regulation and self-representation. Again, very long-term projects. These two things have to do with looking to the future, and the pathways and the community organizing. It has to do with how the government needs to change and how the ayahuasca providers need to come up so they can meet in conversation. And that's looking into the future. And then in terms of the short term, you know, there's two projects that we're doing immediately. One has to do with models of care. That is, how are we going to take care of people what happens when things go wrong? What happens when people take psychedelics and instead of helping, they hurt the person? Are we going to, is your present psychiatrist, the person that is best equipped and has the most information to deal with it? Or how are we going to make a culturally appropriate community care for when things go wrong? This has to do with, the ICER support center and the interaction service, which are just trying to build sort of a model of what the community care around, sort of psychedelic emergencies could look like for the future. And the other one has to do with sort of data journalism. And this has to do with what happens when people get hurt and how this gets portrayed in the media and how that later gets interpreted by the authorities. This is like, very important lesson learned from the 60s, when there was a sort of moral panic around LSD, most of it around false or exaggerated stories that led to a very quick reaction from the government that was, very unfortunate, and how we can, in the short term, stop this. This is basically it. I've spoken a lot. I would like now to open for questions and debate. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to start the conversation.
Okay, thank you, Jerónimo. Wonderful presentation. So now we'll have first the questions and answers section, which will be through the written Q&A. Aili is asking, who defines what is a significant enough part of the original traditional use of ayahuasca, especially when there are many varieties across Peru, Colombia, and Brazil? So who defines what is a significant enough part of the original traditional use of ayahuasca when translocated to use in non-original contexts?
I don't think it's about defining, what is significant or not significant. It's about making a framework that contemplates and accepts the wide diversity of it, right? So the danger is not to, again, the danger is not to establish, is not that, for example, that the ayahuasca religions get, recognized as religions. That's a good thing. But if that means that the way through is only to get recognized as a religion, and that begins to make, other diverse, for example, shamanic uses or folk medicine uses, and they need to now try to pass off as a religion in order to be accepted, that's what's problematic. So it's not about defining what is. I think defining what is part of the problem, or what's the minimum or what's acceptable. The problem is how we make that definition wide enough to encompass all that it is, all the diversity.
Okay, another question. Ansi writes that 2 days ago he read the news in Finland that our health officials have made a new law proposal that intends to criminalize all DMT containing plants. And I find this deeply sorrowful, and I would like to ask if there are any strategies that could help in trying to have a dialogue about the constructive potential of ayahuasca with governmental institutions. I might add to that there's been now some media coverage of the proposed law, and indeed they would like to ban every plant containing DMT, which includes like energy plants commonly used in Finland and some citrus plants and stuff like that. But it's also possible that the discussion that begins from here will end up just banning like plants that are really actually used for DMT.
Yeah, it's very, we take a lot of inspiration from other collectives that have formerly been excluded from our cultures, and they have fought for the recognition and eventually won this battle. So by this I mean, the civil rights movement in the United States, women's vote, gay marriage. That what you find in all of these things is that there is a collective, there's a group of people who's, by design kept out, is not recognized, is being kept out of the, it's illegitimate, is being pushed out. The process is always the same. The collective organizes themselves, and the collective lobbies, and the collective pushes. And it takes time, but eventually, this gets recognized and the system adapts to it. We believe this will be the case also with many of these plants and practices. But for this is important, and that was on my last slide where I talk about self-regulation and self-organization. So part of the work that we're doing, it's sort of beginning to convene meetings of people who are working with these plants and beginning to sort of seed or help accompany processes of self-regulation. Now, again, when you look at other collectives, for example, psychologists or coaches or traditional Chinese medicine, for example. Traditional Chinese medicine it didn't have a fit in our culture. By a fit, I mean a regulatory fit. There was no place for it. And this in the 70s, for example, in California, practitioners began to organize themselves, create a professional association. They began to do lobbying, and they begin to push. And that's how it happened. That's how it happens for just about all these other collectives. Now, these are long battles, but what we know is that eventually it happens. So it's not surprising. I mean, it doesn't surprise me at all that as the use of these plants grow, because like I said, the nature of these things is to keep expanding because they're useful, because people find them useful, so they keep expanding. It's not surprising at all that there will be alarm. Usually this is caused by less efficient facilitators, by accidents, or by simply too many packages or too many incautations happening. But at some point, somebody in the government, will think, do I need to do something about this? Is this a problem? And do I need to do something about this? Do I need to stop it? Now, how do we, in order to have a conversation that is constructive with that person or with that government body, it's very important that the people can sort of self-represent themselves. So it's not the same if you say, hey, dear, we're an organization and we represent, 180 DMT plant facilitators already working in this country. And we would like to talk about this. And we would like to show you, our safety protocols and our screening protocols, and how do we make sure that this doesn't happen. And then you begin to have this conversation, right? That's sort of our strategy, ICER strategy in many different countries, basically revolve around this. And it's a long-term strategy. Now, this is something that it will take years to build, but it has to start somewhere. And it can only start with the people who are directly involved in this, beginning to talk to one another and getting organized. And then,
Okay, the next question is short and intense. If you would be the prime minister, how would you integrate psychedelics into our society?
I think, and this is like I'm halfway through. We are halfway through the process of having a sort of first draft of what we would like to do with this, because it's really quite complicated. So I'm not. It's a very preliminary, and all I can tell you is that we're thinking very hard about this. We have a number of people working on this, and we're hoping that towards the end of this year we will have a more informed proposal, better informed. That at least we can say, hey, we really looked at this, and these 2 or 3 things look like possible paths. So it's not very well defined. But one thing that worries me a lot is the tendency of sort of regulatory practices is that they are, when the government makes a new regulation, this is of anything, this is usually very easy for big companies and very difficult for small players. So I will give you sort of, to understand an example, the EU regulations around alcohol production, if you're going to make alcohol for human consumption, I mean, like drinking alcohol, are quite complicated because they're made for big businesses that make, massive amounts of alcohol. But in some countries in the Balkans, people make this like traditional liquor, rakia, which is basically people have a few plum trees on their backyard and they have a little machine to do it. And then they, everybody, every other neighbor, makes 5 or 15 or 20 or 25 liters of this for himself, for self-consumption, and some for the neighbors. Now, this is anathema for the EU. like the people making alcohol in their backyards, it sounds like a terrible idea. Now, it sounds like a terrible idea because they don't know these people have been making alcohol in their backyards for hundreds of years, and they're actually really good at it. There's not a health issue here, but the law was built that way. So this is the type of thing. A lot of my thought now goes around what is going to happen to what now is sort of very atomized. People working, for example, for ayahuasca are usually like sort of like one or two persons and a group of people that would drink with them. They're very small operations. Now, how do we create a regulatory framework that makes sure that these people don't get pushed out, like it happened to the traditional cannabis growers, or like it's happening, to the traditional rakia makers in the Balkans, etc., etc. This is a part that really worries me, and that we're looking. That's the part that I'm sort of looking at very, very closely. How do you keep this? How do you make a regulation that will be so much bureaucracy that it will push everybody out? And at the same time, how do you make a regulation that protects people from bad actors and from bad workers? Because that's the other side of the question. No? The other side of the question is that, as you know, unfortunately, in unregulated markets, also in regulated ones, but in unregulated markets, what you have is a lot of potential for bad actors, for adulteration of the product, for less prepared people doing things that are outside of their of their skill set, and we've also heard these stories. These are the stories that usually reach the government. Some really crazy people are doing some really weird things with ayahuasca. The people who are doing good work quietly, nobody ever hears about them. But everybody hears about the accidents and the things gone wrong and the really stupid thing that happens. So this is also part of the problem. The Chinese say that everybody hears a tree that falls in the forest, but nobody hears the other 10,000 trees that continue to quietly grow. This is also a fact with this, especially in this sort of underground world, and it's how all of these things are made visible and how you play with these differences. That is I think where the solutions lay.
Yeah, it's a bit like forming your image of motorcycling by working in the emergency ward and thinking exactly. that there are like average examples of what happens when you do motorcycling.
I had a friend whose mother was a nurse at the emergency ward, and she saw all the weekend accidents from drinking and driving, that happened, hundreds of kilometers around, and that had totally and for good screwed up her aspect of how dangerous it was for young people to go out. And this was very difficult for my friend growing up in that household, because the mother saw every day, all the accidents, which actually were, 1% of 1% of all the young people going out. But they were so grave that it really twisted her, sort of, it created a bias in her.
Okay, so the next question is, what are the ayahuasca culture carriers, meaning the shamans, ritual holders, masters, etc., themselves saying about the ayahuasca globalization? Have they given some ideas to larger audiences?
I mean, there is, that's, obviously, engaging the traditional cultures. It's a large piece of this, of doing this work right, and bringing their voices to the table. There's also significant challenges associated with it. Not the least of it is how wide and how big ayahuasca culture is in the Amazon. So, there's some, for example, I don't know, some of you might know this extract called Kana, which comes from a South African plant, and is that used as sort of a mood enhancing supplement. Kana, it's a good example of how, a product was developed for the West, from a traditional source, integrating the knowledge of the traditional carriers and integrating their voices, and even establishing a way to send royalties back to the original communities. It's sort of a textbook case example of things done right, done very, very well, given the complexities. But the thing about Kana is that the actual SAM population is a few thousand people, so it's relatively easy It's not easy, but it's relatively easy to sort of talk to them, find representatives, reach conclusions, and come to agreements. But the ayahuasca traditions in the Amazon, it's hundreds of thousands, and it's spread over 5 countries. And it's so that there's really important and complicated challenges of how to make this inclusive, given how large it is. Now that's not excuse not to do it, but it's sort of a reminder of the complexity of these things.
Okay, the next one is, how would your model of integrating psychedelics into our society look in terms of a user-centric or UX experiment? Maybe you can also open up the terminology a bit, because I think most of the audience are not UX designers.
Yeah, I mean, what the part that I take from there, I think that the part that is used, I won't even go into try to explain to innocent people what user experience is. You don't deserve it. I would say that the most sort of important part to understand about it, about doing that type of work, UX work, is a certain humility about your plans. So it's an understanding that you're going to make a plan, whether it's a pathway around a garden or a website or an app or a policy or whatever. You're going to make a plan, and that when you put that plan in use, when you put that plan in practice, when people start interacting with what you created, many things are going to come up that you would have never foreseen, and that actually show you to your face how the shortcomings of your design. So that's what I mean about humility. It teaches you, what I took from UX is the understanding that whatever is it that, policy, pathways, thing we come up with that will seem like a brilliant plan, it most likely will be full of holes, and these holes will not be seen until you put it in practice. So it's how you're able to actually, find your mistakes as soon as possible and correct them, with minimum consequences. I hope this made sense. Like I said, it's hard to, yeah. I wouldn't want to try to explain to people what user experience is. They don't deserve it. But that's sort of the takeaway from it. It's a certain humility about your plans. The plans or the pathways, your proposals for other people to do. Yeah.
Okay, next one from Tommy. I like the idea of culture and the administration entering into a dialogue. Traditional practices with a religious dimension might have a better chance at negotiating with the administrative organs, because the global north has a category called religious ritual use of X. With some psychedelics, for example, LSD and psilocybin, we don't have a uniform culture in the global north. We have Silicon Valley tech nerds, people who have a love for the retro 60s, university students, new age tinged groups, the rave culture, and a bunch of people who just want to get wasted. Do you think this could be a problem? Can non-uniform or non-structured subcultures have a chance at dialogue with the administrating regulative bodies?
Well, I mean, I think it's one step at a time, and you saw this also, you saw this in cannabis, right? Like, people first it was the medical use, and then it didn't seem like such a big deal, and then it was recreational use, and then that's and the hand is open slowly. I think, part of how this plan is structured, it has to be gradualized. Now it seems that cannabis has gone first, and it seems that psychedelics are coming second. And it seems that in psychedelics, what's coming first is medical use. That's going very, very fast, with maps. And we're literally looking, 4-5 years into the future before some of these things become, prescription medicines, accepted by, first the United States and then probably Europe. Now, the next thing that will happen with that is it will be off-label uses. So you would get MDMA will be for PTSD, treatment-resistant PTSD, and then that will start to happen, and then you get psychiatrists prescribing it for other things that are off-label, but might seem useful, and then like this slowly that path gets more and wider and wider and more open. The part that I'm worried about is that if we put if we put psychedelics only as prescription medicines, then literally the bulk of the uses that they have, again, for people, for personal growth, for spiritual exploration, for creativity, for even recreational uses, will actually get, that door will close. And that's why it's very important to think very carefully about how these things connect to each other and get regulated. But I think, I also think it's sort of unstoppable. Like I was, and it might take a long time. I was recently in an ayahuasca session, and towards the end, this is like after the session, and it was, very beautiful, and each person lived their own experience and went through their own process, myself included. And at the end of the night, I was looking at all of this and I was thinking, like, there's no way that people are going to stop doing this. People who have, at the very least, the people who have, like, tried it, it doesn't matter how much you forbid it or you try to, it doesn't matter. You can keep throwing laws and things at these. People are not going to stop doing this. I'm not going to stop either. Why? Because it's just too useful. It's just too, it's too good. It's too important. Now, it takes a while between people doing something and, and sort of administrative bodies reacting to this. And it takes certainly organizing and pushing, et cetera. But, that is sort of the perspective that I take with this. I think it's going to be, for sure it will be long, but I think you can't put the genie back in the bottle now. It's just, this is just too useful. It will continue to spread like it always has.
There's another question from Aili, who asked the question before about what defines what is significant enough. So, much appreciating the self-organization and strengthening the self-representation of psychedelic facilitators. When and how would you say is an appropriate time and way to start this dialogue with the government? Any successful examples?
Yeah, I mean, I can talk about some of the work we're doing without mentioning where it's happening. So we've been running now a number of pilot programs in some countries for some time. And, I want to stress again, ICERS is a small organization and our resources are limited. So, we're not, but also we don't have the ambition to lead these processes. We don't want to be the flag carriers. What we do is we're sort of like, we seed processes. So, what ICERS can do is, we can, for example, solve legal questions. We can, collect, we can solve medical questions, and we can call meetings. So, a lot of what we've done is, in different countries, we begin to call meetings of facilitators. And these are 3-day closed-door meetings where we discuss issues that are, pertinent to the community. And what ICERS is doing is facilitating. Again, it's not leading. It's just facilitating the meetings and facilitating the work and facilitating the encounter and providing some of the content. Now, out of these meetings in some countries, process of self-organization have begun, where already in a couple of places, it's grown to a significant sort of percentage of the facilitators in the country, and they are beginning to look at ways to, and they are now, we're no longer calling the meetings, they organize themselves. And what we do is we give advice and we give support. Now they are beginning in a couple of countries, they are close to begin to register some sort of organization, that will represent them. Now, when that is done, then the part that ICERS can do is call the meeting. Then we can, through our contacts, we can try to call a meeting with representatives from the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Justice, etc. Different, we look locally who are the people that we can begin to talk to, and we can begin to establish that conversation. So that's how it works. So you see, it's a process, it's a collaboration always, between, what ICERS, can do and what we can do and what we cannot do, right? We cannot organize the local community. We can help people, we can give advice, we can call meetings, but the actual organization, right, that happens, that's the people themselves, right? And we're happy to help, but we can't do it. What we can do once that happens is we can help with the next steps. For example, that part.
The next one is an anonymous question. In the global north, the psychedelics are quite different from traditional plant medicine use. Examples: LSD, NN-DMT, 5-MeO-DMT, DPT, etc. And the culture is being created by individual psychonauts at the moment. I believe the challenge in the future is not so much cultural but metaphysical. What metaphysical framework and meaning-making system can best accommodate the experiences? Most of the plant medicines, Aya, Iboga, peyote, are not sustainable to be imported or consumed by the global north, and the cosmology and metaphysics of traditional plant medicine mostly animistic, and the meanings contextual to their culture and environment.
Yes, absolutely. But this is where the part, I think the part that is important about the traditional cultures is not that we try to copy or work in their cosmologies, but that we understand that because of their very long relationship with these substances, they have some, they can serve the inspiration that we can gather from them is extremely important, and they have sort of accumulated wisdom that is key. I'm just going to give an example. For example, one big issue when you think about regularization of these substances is advertising. That is, how are we gonna talk about these substances to people who don't know them? This in traditional cultures, for example, in Brazil, in the ayahuasca religions, this has been a situation now for more than 60 years. So they actually have rules about it. And there I find quite wise. So in the Santo Daime, which is a religion of Christian, a Christian religion, it's actually a non-proselytistic Christian religion. So it's a Christian religion where it's forbidden to try to convert your neighbors, which is very odd in Christian religions. So this is how it goes. A member of the Santo Daime, the temple of the Santo Daime in Brazil, the temples are always open to anybody. Anybody can go to the Santo Daime and say, I would like to drink ayahuasca, and you will be welcome in. However, members of the Santo Daime are not allowed to invite people from outside their community. So, and this is where the sort of the wisdom, I think the fine part comes. You can tell your neighbors who don't drink ayahuasca, well, I drink ayahuasca and it's really helped me. This is what you cannot do. You cannot say after that, and I think you should try it. Why can't you do this? Well, you can do this because this is so potentially life-changing, and life-disturbing that nobody should take that right over anybody else. And the Santo Daime, after 60 years working with this, understood this very well, even with the best intentions. People have to walk in because of their own free accord. Why do they have to walk in out of the free accord? Because if anything goes wrong in the middle and things get difficult and you feel that somebody convinced you to do it, you're going to want to kill this person, you're going to resist, but if you walk in out of your own accord, and things get difficult, you always have this, well, I wanted it. Now I think this, for example, it's the type of thing where I think that learning from the traditional religion, not copying it, right? It's not about, putting the dress or the feathers or the this or singing the same songs necessarily. It's not about that. It's about what is the sort of wisdom, right? Deeper wisdom that is there that comes from practice that we don't have because we just don't have so many years of practice, right? And what I find, for myself, is that again and again, with many of the big questions that come around regularization, and the use and then all of these, I find, very valid inspiration. Inspiration, mind you, that's a big difference from copying. It's a very big difference from appropriation. It's a very big difference. It has to do with how do we recognize that wisdom and what parts of that wisdom might apply to us without trying to take something that is not ours or trying to copy something that we will never be able to fully understand. Now, my own personal bias, and this is my own personal bias in my work, is for the ritual use of these plants, and it's plants, right? And so I'm not, a lot of my work doesn't revolve around, festivals or trans festivals or, the largest part of sort of recreational use that happens around psychedelics in our culture. That's because I believe that part will also take care of itself. Like I believe the medicalization part will take care of itself. Even sort of the religious freedom right part will take care of itself. But I'm a little bit concerned about what space will sort of facilitators, so people who serve others in a ritual context of these substances will find in our cultures. Because even recreational users will probably find a place when these things eventually become legalized. But how do you legally integrate this practice that happens around sort of shamanic, neo-shamanic types, outside of the countries of origin? This part is, for me, is a big question mark, and it's a large part of what I. So a lot of my personal work has to do with integrating the ritual use of plants outside of their countries of origin. So you see how close this is, right? I'm looking, mostly at ritual use, and I'm looking outside of the countries of origin, and it's a bias of mine. Is the nature of my work. I'm not obviously there's a lot more to do in other aspects, but for myself, that's where my focus is.
I think in this question there was also the core point of the question of what metaphysical framework and meaning-making system can best accommodate the experiences. But I think maybe this can be continued in the free discussion part, because there's a couple of more questions still unanswered. So the next one from Helle is: responsible facilitators refuse to serve ayahuasca to people with contraindications, so these vulnerable people will go to irresponsible facilitators who give ayahuasca to anyone and only ask for money. Therefore, the most vulnerable people get the worst care, while they actually need the best care. Do you have an idea how to fix it? Brilliant question.
This has come up a number of times in our workshops. In terms of because we try to make things practical. In terms of practical advice for responsible facilitators, is that you should never just say no to someone. So the problem is, because there's contraindications, you're not going to give, for example, ayahuasca to this person. So you have to say no. But when you say no, you're protecting the person, but you're also rejecting the person. And you're putting them in a situation where they might go look for something else. So what you want to do is, say something like, this is what we suggest, and this is again, not we suggest, this is what came up in many conversations until we reached what looked like was a good solution from the work of other guys who basically suggested it was, you would say something like, I believe this is not the right time for you to do this, but I suggest that you try this instead. And there is, for example, holotropic breath work. So instead of just saying no to someone, what you do is you present an alternative that is safer. So that way you keep the person in the fold and you keep them protected. And you say, please go try this. I can put you in contact with a friend, see how it goes, and call me back again. I would love to hear about it. And this is how you, right? That's an example of a better practice in which you can say no to someone who shouldn't drink, but you can still protect them from their own desire to drink, and sort of keep them in the fold and slowly bring them to a place where it can work. Where it can work.
Okay, there's 3 more questions. I suggest that the attendants don't write any more questions in the Q&A, but leave them for the free discussion section. So I read these 3 questions and then we'll head on to the free discussion. So first of the 3 from Yuso. I'm thinking about your point that ayahuasca ceremonies are a rare example of psychoactive plant use transposed to a new culture in a way that it has retained lots of the cultural context. I'm thinking, do you still see problems in our approach to ritual use of psychedelics in the West? I'm thinking issues around the whole cultural context and how in traditional societies the ceremonies are much more strongly embedded in the culture the meanings around them are in a way more integrated to the rest of society and life. But in Western countries, the ceremonies easily are relatively isolated from other aspects of life. Also, transposing the cultural ideas and worldview, etc., around the psychedelics seems for me to be a territory with difficult issues, that the whole worldview in Amazon is pretty different.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, one thing that is very, very different here, even when all the cultural events are taken, even if you take like a very, very traditional shaman from an Amazonian society and you bring them here and you are getting a fully quote unquote traditional ceremony, still what changes, and it cannot be dealt with, is the fact that usually these ceremonies take part in a community context. And what happens in a community context is that people know one another. So in a community context, people usually know the back history of this person. They know that this person has some problems. Maybe they know. So, so screening sort of happens. There's not a necessity for a process of screening. And then the same thing with follow-up. In a community context, if a person after the ceremony, in 2 weeks, 3 weeks, they're not doing well, and they're still having problems, well, the community is going to know and something is going to be done. So there's no need for formalized, or there's less need for formalized process of screening and for formalized processes of follow-up, but in our cultures, where you get a group of strangers or almost near strangers who get together on a weekend to drink ayahuasca in what might be a very traditional context, or in a very traditional ceremony, but still, and then after the weekend, they're all each going to go back to their, lives. Suddenly you find that there is a need for additional things that were not necessary in the traditional context. There's a need for additional screening. There's a need for additional follow-up, and this is unavoidable, right? This is why, the event, I think even sort of purely, very, very rigorously traditional sort of systems are they're complete in their origin, in their context, in their original context, but they are in ways incomplete when they travel here. We need additional things just to make it work in our context, and this is part. And recognizing these lacks is part of it, right? So then there's need for integration, there's need for screening, there's need for follow-up, there's need for things that are not necessary in the same way in the traditional contexts.
Question from Alexi. Do you think it would be essential for a medical practitioner to have gone through a psychedelic experience themselves before engaging in giving therapy sessions to patients? Classic question.
This is my personal opinion. I think absolutely yes. I mean, I think that's also a piece of wisdom, that we get from the traditions. It's like, until you can handle these states in yourself, and handle them quite well, and that means years, you should not be in the business of giving this to other people. That's just my personal opinion. Now, this is, a big paradigm shift. And I've seen, and this is a big issue, of course, in people who want to do psychedelic therapy, who are psychologists and whatever, and they're wondering, should I try this? Do I have to try this? Should I be required to try this? Now, people asked me before, if I was prime minister, I myself, if I was prime minister, I would say absolutely you'd be required. Not just you would be required to. I mean, you would have to be, quite experienced before you can even dare. Just because this is that sort of situation where, like, I mean, it's just going to make you a better practitioner to actually know what you're getting. And the part that it opens, that I think it's really interesting, and that's where sort of the paradigm shift happens, is that what would happen if this wasn't just for psychedelics? What if psychiatrists were required to try most of the things they prescribe on themselves before they give it to other people? How would that change things? Because I mean, I think it would be, a sort of very valid and fascinating question. I mean, we have these people just because they studied for 11 years, are now giving, powerful psychiatric drugs to other people, and they don't even know what they're giving them. That's for me, like a sort of, a very good example of the sort of, wisdom that comes from the traditions, and that we can, that we would be wise to take into consideration. I mean, I don't know, is what I said before. It's like, if you're going to make wine, you be well advised to maybe talk, and you're from, I don't know, some country that doesn't traditionally make wine. You be well advised to talk to people who have been making wine for a long time. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to make your wine exactly like them, but it just seems, because these people know the grapes and they know the aging process, and they're just going to save you a lot of trial and error. And I think it's the same for these things.
So, final question. What are the major problems and traps on the process of integration of antiogenics in our current situation, and how we need to grow up to fit to the process in a more optimal way?
I think the one major sort of challenge and danger is that we tend to do things very fast, and we tend to think of things in terms of scale. And this is, for example, the part that worries me about a lot of the sort of medicalization efforts that I see around psychedelics. It's not that they're trying to develop medicines around psychedelics. It's that they're trying to develop medicines that can be like deployed at huge scale very, very fast. I think that's a little bit, it's like, I think, no one can deny that these are very, very, very powerful substances. And that, for that same reason, they have enormous potential to help, but they also have enormous potential to, to go all sorts of ways. It's like, if you think of, I don't know, of a machine gun or I don't know, or a really sharp knife. A really sharp knife can be, extremely useful, and it can help you cook, and it can help you survive, and it can help you many things. But it's also, a cutting surface that, can create it can do a lot of damage. And that's why I don't let my daughters, play with knives or run with knives yet, So how do we develop that sort of understanding around psychedelics? I think it's one of the big key missing parts. And I think that, the sort of the ability to use psychedelics well, to administer psychedelics to other people and do that well, doesn't scale very good and doesn't scale very fast. It's a process that takes many years to learn, to do right, and is fraught with complexities. It worries me, the hurry. It worries me, the idea of like how in 5 years, when this becomes a prescription medicine, and basically any psychiatrist in the United States is going to be able to administer MDMA to people without ever having tried it on them themselves, without ever having given therapy, right? Like, how do you do that? And I know, MAPS is thinking very hard about that. The part of the training is really, really difficult, the scale. And this is like MDMA for PTSD, which is, pretty, it's not a super huge condition with like, it's not like depression where you get like, 2, 4, or 5% of the population have it. PTSD is like, it's, treatment resistance PTSD is really small, and still they cannot train enough people fast enough for when this becomes legal.
Okay. Thank you for these amazing answers. So we will now be heading to the free discussion section. But before that, I imagine some of the participants might leave us at this point. So before they go, if people want to follow your work, where can they do that?
If you just Google my name, you can find certain things. There's a Twitter account, and and there's a Facebook where I post stuff, and and you can, of course, you should also follow ICEERS. Just Google my name and Google ICEERS, and you will find plenty of feeds.